And our Torah portion this week is Tzav, right? You already know this. Hopefully you already know this. And what I'd like to do tonight, which is going to take tonight and tomorrow to really lay out the case that I think we have here for this upcoming Shabbat. But again, we're not reading this in isolation from our previous Torah portion and the previous Torah portion and the previous Torah portion. We're still pulling it in, and we're still pulling it all together. And so in this particular Torah portion, if you've pre-read through the material, you realize that it's very heavy in sacrifices and priestly duties. And I still mean what I said. If we don't know what's going on in the book of Vayikra, then we do not understand our vocation. We won't understand what it is we're supposed to be doing on this earth. And so what I'd like to do is not take so much material directly out of the Torah portion that we haven't already dipped out of last year and perhaps the year before, but especially last year when we did Tzav, we looked specifically at the Olah offering. I believe. I haven't gone back and listened to the recording or anything, but I'm 99% sure that we spent a lot of time talking about the Olah offering as a resurrection offering, and a lot of time talking about the ashes beside the altar and pairing that understanding of how the ashes had to be handled beside the altar to the souls that are under the altar in Revelation, who are crying out, "How long, O Lord, until you avenge our blood on the earth?" And so in the back of your mind, unless you're fairly new to the class, you understand that Tzav is very heavy in resurrection messages. It's speaking to us very much about a preparation to move back into the garden, because it speaks of the Tamid offerings, the Olah offerings that have to be offered evening and morning, day after day. It doesn't matter which day of the year it is. It doesn't matter if it's also a high Sabbath. These Olah offerings still have to go up uninterrupted day after day, because Olah means, of course, going up. And when you start using language like Olah or going up, then we understand it does have a specific context of the resurrection. And so if you want to understand the resurrection, this has to be one of the places that you're looking. So if you are, let's say, reading in the New Testament, and you start reading passages that you're pretty sure they do have to do with the resurrection and ascending in the last days, and we're going to be looking at a lot of the wrath passages in this week's lesson. We do want to look at the cup of wrath, because Passover is coming up, and most of you should realize, if you've done the Passover for a few years, that there is a cup of Elijah that's traditionally prepared. What many people don't understand about this little comedy that we play out, where we have a cup of Elijah and we have the kids run to the door and look to see if Elijah's there, like, Santa Claus days and years gone by, that it's much more serious than that. It's not like looking for Santa Claus. If you understand this cup of wrath, and if Elijah were actually out there, what that would mean to the world. Because that's when we would know that the wrath of the Lamb was falling. It's not the good cup, right? It's not the cup of salvation. It's not the cup of redemption. It's not the cup of sanctification. It's a cup of wrath. And it's the cup, and it's, again, has to do with drinking your own cup of abominations. This cup of wrath that gets poured out in Revelation, for those who don't really discern the times, and who are like the virgins who didn't have enough oil to make it through the night, it is going to be a very scary time. And I'm not telling you at this time in history not to have a healthy fear. And by fear, I mean the biblical kind. Yirat Adonai is what it's called. Yirat Adonai means a heavy respect and reverence. Yes, fear and trembling, but before Adonai, not before your bank statement. And I know a lot of you probably getting, okay, we just got this thing extended now, and how long can I stay home and not work? Or how long can I stay home and work at partial pay? What about my children? What about my grandchildren? What about my parents? Who's going to take care of them if they're sick? Or who's going to take care of me if I get sick? We all have all types of questions. Those are not the things to be afraid of. The reverence of Adonai is what, at this point in our history, we have to internalize already. And so as the events get rougher and tougher, then our awe and our trembling before him will grow deeper, whereas we will care less about the things that can be done to us in the physical world, in the world of economics, because, you know, Big Red Truck, you've been reading the book of Revelation most of your life since you could read, and you already know the economic system's going to fail. It's not big news. It's only news on CNN and Fox and ABC and NBC and whatever letters you want. It's news to them. It's news to the world, but it's not news to you that the economic system will fail to some extent. In every generation, you're going to have an antichrist. And in every generation, you'll typically have somebody rise up in acts of righteousness and courage to lead forth. And so whether this is the end of all days economic fail, or whether it's our generational economic fail, these things are not the things to cause trembling. Because you know it's going to happen, number one. If you know something's going to happen, you're not as afraid. It doesn't mean you won't be uncomfortable. Just like Noah knew the flood was coming. Okay, there's a sense of assurance there, but there's still a sense of fear and trembling, knowing how many people will die and suffer. And number two, it's going to be a very uncomfortable ride. You know, I don't know if you've ever smelled pitch, but the ark was covered in it. That stuff's nasty, all right? It's just nasty. So, you know, we might put up with some nasty, you know, days ahead. I feel pretty firm that we will. I feel pretty sure that next week this time, it's going to be tougher than it is right now. And 2 weeks from now, it's going to be tougher than it is next week. I'm pretty sure that a virus is not our only problem right now. You know, those horses come in succession. We've got the white horse, we've got the plague going out, we've got the red horse, which is going to be taking peace from the earth. And my husband and I were talking about that after he got home from work today. They've gone from screening, 800 people a day at the courthouse to 7 now. But the domestic calls are going up, because people have been cooped up together. And if you weren't sure you liked your wife or your husband to begin with, you might find out for sure you don't like them now. If you weren't real sure you liked your kids, you might find out you don't like them now. There's somebody else's kids in my house. But you get cooped up together, and, you know, the tempers are going to flare. So, you know, there's going to be different kinds of problems that are, they're going to basically, one falls out of the other like dominoes. And that's okay. It's all right if it happens. We don't have to fear those events. Our fear and trembling has to be with his word, because believe it or not, he's written everything in here that we need to cope. And yes, to have a healthy respect for what's about to come on the world to whatever degree, but also how to react in our generation, whether it's, this is our wake-up call for this generation, or whether it's the last wake-up call for all generations. We don't know that. But in every generation, when you get your wake-up call, then you have to respond to it as if it were the last wake-up call that would ever be. And that's why I wanted to, yes, take the things mostly things that you already know about this Torah portion from last year. The idea of the sacrifices representing the resurrection and so forth, and the souls under the altar and how they correspond to the book of Revelation. But I want to get you ready for next Shabbat. That's my most important goal for today and tomorrow. And if you'll notice, I extended an invitation, no matter which class you were in, Monday or Tuesday, you're going to get the invitation for both classes. You don't have to accept them, but if you want to, if you're home, if you're not working, you got free time, you're welcome in till and if we go back to normal, right? Which there's always room. Unless I get 100 people in a class, I don't have an issue with Zoom. So next Shabbat we really need to be concerned with this, because there's a lot of these little Jewish holidays that'll pop up if you have a Jewish calendar. I hope you do. I hope you do have a genuinely Jewish produced calendar that's geared toward Jews for a specific reason. Most of us don't pay much attention to a very special Shabbat that's called Shabbat HaGadol. And this Shabbat's coming up is Shabbat HaGadol. You say, well, this is one of those cute little extra things that the Jews put on their calendar. But tonight and tomorrow, I want to go through some things in Malachi, like you learned in Sunday school, where he seems to be prophesying about the events surrounding Shabbat HaGadol, which is going to fall on the Shabbat before Pesach. And so, yes, Pesach is important, but something had to have already been done the Shabbat before, the Pesach. And so in terms of the history and the sequence of events and so forth, yes, it'll probably take me both class sessions to get through all the material. But I want you to understand that the preparation of this Shabbat and what you do on Shabbat Shuvah, which is going to come with the fall feast. This falls in the spring. It has to fall in the month of Nisan because it's the month of creation. It's the first of the months, right? So we know that the spring feast and the fall feast are like mirrors. They're like written as a chiasm of one another. Even though you can't separate them, yet they are one, just like, where's my menorah? I can't talk without a menorah. All right, so you've got one side of your feast, you got the other side of your feast, and that's why you understand, I have to look at Passover and Sukkot similarly, right? Just like you have the white horse riding out of Passover, expect to see that white horse show up at Sukkot as well, in terms of what he's doing in the earth. So we have Shabbat HaGadol in the spring, with the spring feast, just before Pesach. It's going to be that Shabbat. And then in the fall, there's going to be a Shabbat called Shabbat Shuvah. And that's going to fall between the Feast of Trumpets, Yom Teruah, Rosh Hashanah, whatever you call it, and Yom HaKippurim, which is 10 days later. So it'll be the Shabbat between the two of them. And these two Shabbats as bookends of these feasts, we need to understand them in the context of the great and the terrible day of the Lord, as it's called in Malachi. And we're even going to take a look at the special psalm for Shabbat HaGadol. And we're going to say, well, I don't read about this Shabbat anywhere. It must just be coming out of Jewish literature. Well, it does, but even Jews don't know where it came from. It doesn't even pop up in history in terms of somebody commenting on it in written form. They say, well, we've been doing this, or it's referred to as this, but nobody seems to know where it came from. But they think it can be attributed back to the time of Malachi. when he prophesied. And if you remember, he's the last prophet of the Tanakh. He's going to be the last voice that we hear before Yeshua is born into the earth. So in that gap of silence between the prophecy of Malachi and when we start reading in the Gospel of Matthew, that's going to be the approximate time period that people start thinking about this in terms of that prophecy. And so once you see the context of it, the first context of Shabbat HaGadol, it'll make sense to you why it's just as important what happens on Shabbat HaGadol as what happens on Pesach. Because Pesach, by the time we got to Pesach, the death angel coming, the preparation had to have already been made. In other words, as the sun's going down, that's not when you run out and you try to find a lamb. It's too late. It's everlasting too late at that point when the sun's going down to run out and find a lamb. It's timing. And that's why I think, we've just got to pray that. I think we've got a lot of people interested in what the Bible has to say at this point. But if they've waited until this point, I'm not sure how long their oil will hold out. Because the words we're engaging, we're not just reading them and getting, more wisdom and understanding of the Bible. The people in this class especially were reading them in order to be them. We want to internalize it. We want to eat it like food so that now it's just oozing out of who we are, that we're taking on this identity of Yeshua, this living word, so that when people see us, they see the light of the Torah shining out of us. They see the commandments. The Torah is a light, the commandments a lamp. We want people to see this word shining through us with the power of the Holy Spirit. And so it's always been available. But we have a generation out here, and then we could say this of any generation. They have engaged in their everyday activities. And in our generation, our problem is there's so many we can do. You can run yourself crazy just taking the kids to practices, sports practice, dance practice, quiz bowl practice, all the, I think my mom went to one basketball game in my whole career. She went to one. It just wasn't that big a thing back then. You went off and did your activities, but your parents weren't joined at your hip. And you could walk to basketball practice and you could walk home. You didn't have to be driven everywhere you went because there were predators out there. It was fine to walk a mile or two to school. Nobody was going to bother you. In fact, nobody would want to. We were rough kids. But at any rate, we've become so distracted. We've got internet, we've got all sorts of activities. We can go to classes, or we can just surf the internet to infinity. Not really ever learning anything, just picking up bits and pieces of trivia and so forth. Instead of navigating like this class where we're going step by step through the Torah year after year after year. What are we doing? We're growing because we're building on top of building, on top of building, on top of building. That's why I don't really need to go over again the ashes under the altar. Even if you don't remember exactly, you can go back and you can pull up your notes or you can pull up the whole recording. But for the people who don't have the patience for this kind of study, they're the ones I'm worried about. Because remember, the messages to the 7 assemblies aren't written to people who don't know what to do. It's written to people that have the book. They have the information already. Otherwise, the messages would have been written completely differently. It would have been pretty much for God so loved the world. it would have been that kind of message. It wouldn't have been a message so deep and full of the feasts and the Torah and even Jewish tradition, especially as we get into the message to Sardis, which is written in the language of the synagogue. So it's written to people who should know. They're expected to know. They have no reason not to know. So we've got a lot of people out there with great intentions, but over time, their commitment to the word, it gets smaller, smaller, smaller. And trust me, there is no such thing as quality time when it comes to the word. Just like there's no such thing as quality time when it comes to your kids. Your kids don't want your quality, they want your time. Right? Well, the Father wants the same thing. He knows it's going to take time. And he needs you to expand. Remember, expanding the Mishkan so that more of his presence can come into your life. Well, the more you expand your study in order to do, not just to get smarter and have stupid conversations on the internet about how much you know more than somebody else. Somebody else will always know more, trust me. You know, you'll think you're really good, and then somebody who really knows your stuff will come along and you're like, well, I'm just going to keep my mouth shut so they won't know how dumb I am. There's no point in trying to prove you know more, but there is a point in trying to be more. And the only way you be more is to have this oil crushed out of you so hard, because the more you study this, the more it will crush you. I mean, I can't tell you the last couple of weeks how much stuff is getting crushed out of me. And it's not that conscious an effort anymore, because there's so much word in us. It's like every little thing I've done or said, even if I didn't think it was that important at the time I did or said it, it's coming into my remembrance. And I'm getting the message, take care of that before the great Sabbath. Take care of that thing before that Shabbat comes. Get that thing out of the house. Don't let it back in there. Don't let those thoughts back in there. It's not okay to think that way anymore. It's not okay to be that casual with your words anymore. Clean it up. And see, I have to clean up the thought process, which means I have to clean up the heart process. So it's an interior search for the chametz that begins much earlier than the actual Passover. That's why you can't wait till the night of Passover to go look for a lamb. And so for these commandments, you're not able to just cruise through life like somebody else. Your standards of holiness are higher. That's why you're reading Vayikra. You're learning what it means to be a holy priesthood. And that's when you realize, wow, I really do have to conduct myself in a much holier way than the people around me without being a holier than thou, while maintaining my humility. See, I can't use that holiness as like that standoff and don't touch me thing. I still have to go out there and be light to them. And that's the thing. In order to do that, they will hurt you. Trust me, the people you're trying to be light to are the very people who are going to hurt you. They're going to hurt your feelings. You're going to be tempted to be offended. They're not going to understand you. They're going to make fun of you. And if they're not doing it to your face, trust me, they're doing it some other place, but they're doing it. When you say, well, I prefer to have off the Passover week when I take my vacation. Okay, the bounce back you're going to get just over statements like that. What's it going to do? It's going to crush you and crush you and crush you. That's how you get the extra oil to make it through what's coming. Because if you have never before suffered for the sake of the word, this is not the time to start scrambling around, figuring out what's in it, number one, and then realizing if you've not made a habit, if you've not made a practice of being crushed for the sake of this word, you won't hold up And then you're going to listen to the first deceiver that starts spouting a lie or doing something that seems remarkable, who gives you some sort of sign or a miracle to follow after, who promises you the economy is going to be fine, who promises you that you're not going to lose your house, who promises you you're not going to lose your car, who says that you're going to be healthy, who says everything's going to be fine, your children will be, smart and beautiful. Because you want to believe that, and you're not used to being crushed, you'll follow after that. When maybe what the scripture is saying, don't fear what you're about to suffer. Isn't that what John wrote? Don't fear what you are about to suffer. You're going to be thrown into prison for 10 days to be tested. In other words, there's going to be some confinements. You will experience some confinements in the coming days, but don't fear what you're about to suffer. Fear the one who wrote the instruction. Don't fear what you're about to suffer. There's no reason to be afraid of that kind of suffering. Because if you've already learned to suffer for the sake of Messiah, this is going to be okay. If you're not used to suffering for the sake of the Messiah, this is probably not going to be okay. It's going to hurt a lot. It is going to be uncomfortable for all of us, but we don't want to be deceived by unbelief. And that's what's the remarkable thing. The writer of the Hebrews seems to be familiar with Shabbat HaGadol. Even though Judaism is not sure where it came from, the writer of the Hebrews is giving us some really pointed clues to the Shabbat HaGadol in the passage where he talks about the rest that remains. And he's putting it back into the context even of the traditional reading of the psalm on that particular Shabbat. And so this is within the tradition in Judaism. They say that Shabbat HaGadol and Shabbat Shuvah are the two most important Shabbats in your year. Because how we observe these Shabbats can actually affect the degree of wrath that comes with the Lamb, basically, as John would put it. In Judaism, they would say it would sweeten the judgments. In other words, judgments are coming. It's coming. There's no doubt it's not going to be turned back. But how it comes, when Messiah comes, and these Shabbats are directly related to the return of Messiah, by the way. And they say we must keep these two Shabbats, because if we keep these two Shabbats as like with the revival mindset, then Mashiach will come and it will be less wrath than what has already been determined based purely on behavior. And they even say within Judaism, if Jews would just keep two Shabbats, Mashiach would come. And they say these are the two. So let me start screen sharing. I don't usually talk that much before we just get into it, but I did, in case some of you did have to jump off and go do something, I just wanted to make you aware of this coming Shabbat. And if you've never, done the best job of keeping Shabbat before, this is going to be the one to do it. Okay, so we're kind of pairing two things here, and I put down the readings for Tzav, which means command, which we're going to connect directly to the Exodus Torah portion, Bo. It's very important to see still in these contexts, because there's going to be, I know I've taught you a bunch of tools for biblical interpretation, and placement is a big thing. But there's all sorts of methods that we've studied that he uses, like equivalency of expression, where he puts the real estate on the page in terms of the text and so forth. But sometimes things will seem to be out of order when they're really not, or he wants you to see a different order than what it's actually written in to help you connect a couple of things. So anyway, here's your scriptures, the normal scriptures, and then I put the psalm for Shabbat HaGadol, which is Psalm 95, and eventually we'll break that down. And then a sample of the passage out of Hebrews is Hebrews 3:7 through 19. And once you go through the lesson, then I think you'll see why Hebrews 3:7 through 19 appears to be alluding specifically to the Shabbat HaGadol, and then, of course, its association with the great and the terrible day of the Lord. Let me minimize where I can actually read what's up there. There we go. So, and that's my thoughts on this coming Shabbat. I think it's the Shabbat of your lifetime. And that's why I think we should work on the inside. Work deeply on the inside. Whatever the Holy Spirit is bringing to your attention at this time in your life, don't put it to the side to work on later. Work on it right now. Deal with it right now. If there's someone you need to apologize to ask forgiveness, to return something you never gave back, i.e. so if there's anything like that you need to do, try to put those things back where they belong before the Shabbat. Don't wait till Passover. Don't wait that long. Because here's the problem. Remember what we talked about last week, maybe it was in the live stream, where we're commanded basically to watch the mitzvah. Don't let it become chametz. In other words, don't delay when you have a mitzvah to perform, in the same way that you don't delay to bake the bread, to make matzah. Because remember, matzot and mitzvot are spelled the same. And so if you've got to get that matzah in the oven, basically in 18 minutes, so that it won't start rising and fermenting, your mitzvot need to be the same way, especially at this time of year. Don't put the mitzvah off, because when you put a mitzvah off, then you're increasing the likelihood that something will come in there and disrupt your ability to do it. You could have had good intentions, but if you delay, then you let the mitzvah ferment. And we don't want that to happen this time of year. We want to be especially sensitive to the things that we don't need to put off until tomorrow. Because it could be that this Shabbat, he's recalibrating the world. You know, when you've got a speedometer and you're getting a ticket for going too fast, and you say, but officer, this is what my speedometer said. It said I was doing 40. I couldn't have been doing 55. And he says, then it's time for you to recalibrate your speedometer. Something's off. And at this point, in terms of time, we know that Shabbat rest is going to be part of this idea of the end of days. The recalibration for Israel came in the month of Nisan. Remember, this is when it's finally pointed out, because you don't hear much about time. You don't hear much about the Shabbat between the creation, and then all of a sudden we get into Shemot, and he says, this is going to be the beginning of months for you. All of a sudden now time becomes important again. We began with the concept of Shabbat and time and rest. And then it's just like there's a silent period. And then all of a sudden now there's a recalibration. And the whole world's basically going to know about it, because at this point the whole world knows about what goes on in Egypt. And so what happens on this Shabbat, that's why I say it could be the most critical Shabbat in your life in terms of the greater redemption. We don't know where it came from, but it seems that the the writer of the letter to the Hebrews knew about it. And we're really not even sure who wrote it. Some people say Paul, but some people say, no, that's not his writing style. But he seems to have had a grasp of Shabbat HaGadol. And again, it's going to occur the Shabbat before Pesach. And so it's not going to be in the order of our Torah portion readings, but it's going to be in content of readings. It's going to help us connect some things, because if you've looked through the Torah portion, you realize that there's going to be an offering of matzot, unleavened bread, that is described very specifically, and how it has to be offered with the oil and with the incense on top of it and so forth. It's going to be a pretty pointed reference to matzot. Say, okay, well, where have we heard about matzot before? We're going to go back to a very particular Torah portion called Bo, which starts in Exodus 12. So it's not in the chronological order of the Torah portion readings that Passover is going to come up, because we're well past that. If we look at the chronological order of the Torah portion readings, we would actually have to go back into Shemot to say, okay, here's where this information is going to be. But when you look at the content of the particular Torah portion reading, that's how we know it corresponds to the Torah portion Bo. The chronological correspondence is going to fall around Tzav. Right? It is going to fall into the Book of the Holies. But it's going to be in the Torah portion Bo, where the Hebrews took a lamb, slaughtered it, and placed the blood on their doorposts. And Shabbat HaGadol pretty much rests upon that date. The timing of Shabbat HaGadol is the Shabbat before that. That's what it's going to depend on. The 14th of Nisan, whenever that is in any year, it's going to be the Shabbat before that. What you'll notice is that in terms of the Torah portion Bo, because remember, you've been keeping your index cards now that tell you a summary or bullet points of what's found in each Torah portion, so that when you read it in the New Testament, you know which Torah portion or portions to go back to. This content command, remember at this point it's not chronological on a typical annual cycle. But this content command of Bo, you'll hear used repetitively in the book of Revelation, and it's the four living creatures who were saying it. They'll say, come, 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 come. And we know from Ezekiel's description of the four living creatures that their job is to execute the will of the Holy One. In other words, it's the spirit of Adonai. When they move, it's because the Spirit moves. And so it's going to be their job to execute the will of the Holy One. When he wants something to bow, then those four living creatures are going to make sure something bows, that it comes. It can also, bow can also mean go, come or go. You have to know the context. So at the point in Revelation where we're hearing bow, 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 we realize that the wrath is being called out upon the earth. That wrath is going to come through these four horses are coming out as harbingers, and what they're carrying with them are the four altar judgments that Moses prophesied. And those four altar judgments will be manifest as various plagues, just like they were manifest in 10 plagues on Egypt. There were actually more than that, but for the sake of history, there were 10 plagues. And each one of them you can trace back to one of the four altar judgments. And again, remember, this is where the souls reside as they are waiting upon this wrath to be executed upon the earth. They're waiting under the altar, which is where the resurrection ashes had to be collected. So in that sense, it's very much connected chronologically to Tzav, to our current Torah portion, which gives us very precise details on the handling of those ashes, knowing what it represents. So this is why we see souls crying out in Revelation, "How long, O Lord, until you avenge our blood on the earth?" That's not just a bloodthirsty call, like, go ahead and kill them all. That's not really what they're after here. We have to go back and look at the context of how they suffered on the altar. Because our lives are basically an ongoing process. Remember, the Olah offering was every morning, every evening. If you at any point ever think that he's going to quit requiring that relationship with you, that surrender of your will, there's just not any days where it's not like that. Again, that's how you press the oil out of your life that's going to sustain you. And so in the Torah portion, we have precise instructions about the ashes of the Olah, the resurrection offering. We've got the souls crying out under the altar, "How long, O Lord, until you avenge our blood on the earth?" Well, there are some other applications of that question. But for this context, for Tzav, what they're asking, they're referencing the personal sacrifices that each soul has to bring to the fire of the altar. Now, that resurrection offering is going on twice a day, every day, no matter what. But not every offering that's brought is for the sake of resurrection, right? And in fact, we have to put that in the context of Yeshua. But if we look at our personal sacrifices, our personal soul repairs that we hope to accomplish, basically to seal the relationship by bringing grain smeared with oil, by bringing animal souls as a substitute for us to represent our surrender of the animal will. It's interesting. He asks not just for clean animals, but he will say of the flock or of the herd. And for instance, with a herd animal, they tend to do everything alike. If you've ever watched, say, a herd of cows or a herd of buffalo, if one does it, they all do it. And that's how you get in a lot of trouble. If you're just doing stuff because everybody else does it, eventually you're probably going to have to bring in a sacrifice, because you're going to realize the herd mentality will often lead you in the wrong direction. So obedience to the word is part of this sacrificial system. And along with this reminder every day of the Olah offering, against this expectation that there's going to be a miracle of resurrection of the souls, that we continually have this Olah offering going up. However, we could become hardened against it, right? And that's what sin will do. It will harden your heart against this miracle of resurrection. And what do I mean by that? You see people who are, and almost after reading the passage to Hebrews today several times, I almost want to quit calling them believers, because according to the book of Hebrews, they are not. But we typically call people who believe in Yeshua as believers, and then people who don't believe in Yeshua as non-believers or unbelievers. But that's not exactly the way the writer of Hebrews defines things. He defines it as somebody who has believed and then become hardened by sin, so that they become disobedient. They once were obedient, but now they're disobedient. And he says that's an unbeliever. Not the person who's never made a commitment, the one who knew and then thought it was going to be okay to just keep on sinning without dealing with this heart transaction that we talked about last week. this this voluntary, this love that we have for the Father. And he says, if your heart is hardened so that you start sinning, then what you're actually doing is you're disregarding this future miracle of resurrection. Because once we are resurrected, there will be an accounting. That's why if you look at the progression of the Torah portions, Vayakel and assembled, Kitisa, when you elevate, Pekudei, at the reckoning, and each one of them is explaining to you some aspect of the resurrection or the gathering into the clouds. You realize that Pekudei, the reckoning, the accounting is absolutely, just like in Kitisa, it's part of this process. It's not just all, peace, love, floating on a cloud, drinking hot chocolate. There is an accounting that goes on with this miracle of resurrection. And it's not as if the Father's just going to completely forget that our hearts have been hardened to sin. And so you could see this Olah offering going up every day on your behalf and actually become hardened against what it represents. And so those who live their lives according to that expectation of the miracle of resurrection, understanding the sacrifice of the Olah offering Yeshua, they have lived lives of also continually offering up their souls on the altar. And so once they have passed away, they have that realization that, yes, my ashes, in a sense, are being stored in a specific place. But I have lived my life according to this expectation of resurrection. And so basically, their blood has been shed upon the earth. As, to the degree that you have known Messiah in the fellowship of his suffering, you've also shed your own blood. You've also had the oil pressed out of you. And so I think this reflects the question, how long till you avenge our blood on the earth? It's not that they're necessarily wanting you to go out and kill everybody, but it's like, look, I lived a sacrificial life, but my sacrificial life is not complete until the last soul rests under this altar, until the last shovelful of ashes is placed to the side of this altar. And so they're saying, we're waiting for this last soul to be clicked in basically to the body of Messiah so that Messiah can return to the earth, right? And then they can also return with him, and all the sacrifices that they made for him because they loved him, then his kingdom can be set up. I don't think it's just a bloodthirsty call for vengeance. But let's go back to our Torah portion, Bo, that sets the stage for this wrath of the Lamb and the coming of the plagues. And so we go back to Exodus 10:1. It says, then the Lord said to Moshe, go, or Bo, to Paro, for I have hardened his heart and the heart of his servants, that I may perform these signs of mine among them, and that you may tell in the hearing of your son and of your grandson how I made a mockery of the Egyptians, and how I performed my signs among them, that you may know that I am the Lord. Right, you can see that twice he mentions the signs. And we're down, I believe, at this point, maybe not. Okay, I thought we were in Exodus 12. Okay, we're back 2 chapters from there. Nevertheless, we're in the Torah portion, Bo. So we're right in the midst of the plagues. And at this point, the clarification of Bo, which is what you hear the 4 living creatures saying to the horsemen of Revelation, Bo, go. And like I said, it also means come in Hebrew. But he's talking about performing these signs of mine and telling them in the hearing of your son and your grandson. And then he says the signs again. Why are the signs important? Well, we're going to connect them to something, but think in terms again of revelation. We have an alternate. Remember, we've got the beast and the false prophet and the great harlot, but we have this beast that's able to perform these great signs, these miraculous signs, these deceptive signs. But we already have a context for that. Remember, we had the testing of the apostles that is prophesied to the 7 assemblies, but our context, again, is Pharaoh's magicians. They're able to produce false signs. And so that's why I say you can't rush at the last minute and pick up a Bible and think you're going to have enough oil that you're going to rise above all the deception and the signs that you're going to see in the world, because these signs are going to be things that you want to see. Because if you're troubled, you want comfort. If you don't have direction, you'll look for a leader. And the beast is going to be able to perform these signs, but we're already warned about them back in back in the Exodus, that there are going to be the signs of the Holy One, and we will know which signs these are because we already have the context of the word. However, when we look at the beast and the false prophet, they are going to try to imitate the signs of Moses and Aaron, just like the magicians tried to imitate the signs of Moses and Aaron. So it's going to be tough. That's why I say you can't pick up a Bible at the last second and learn everything from Genesis to Revelation. But if you know what the proper signs are, and you know the commandments of Adonai, then these deceptive signs in Revelation shouldn't affect you. This language, it's going to be revisited later in the same Torah portion. Because Moses, in that same Torah portion, he's going to tell the Hebrews to select a lamb and prepare it for specific reasons that he's already stated, right? And it's going to go right back to Exodus 10:1. Now, you're going to hear some of this language again when Moses tells the Hebrews how to do this. But this language right here in Exodus 10:1, it's going to tie your content portion, which is Bo, with your chronological portion, Tzav, which means Bo is come and Tzav is command. And that's what I just wanted to remind you. When we're looking at Torah texts, especially trying to match up ones that are separated in terms of books or chapters or whatever, or even between the Tanakh and the Brit Hadashah, what you want to look to tie things together is a word repetition. If you see words, remember words in the hood? If I keep seeing these words show up in the same neighborhoods, then I might be onto something. He'll use the chiasms. You know how to look for those now. He'll repeat themes. He'll use play on words. Sometimes it's the word will be pronounced the same as another, but it'll be a slight difference. Like maybe an aleph and an ayin. You know, if you want to understand the garments of skin and the garments of light, then you go back to or and or. One spelled with an aleph and one spelled with an ayin. And then you kind of get why we had garments of light in the garden as opposed to animal skins. But in some cases, he'll actually use time and geography as hints. I think we saw that when we studied Hebron and Yosef, and even going back to the events in the days of Abraham, that we were able to assess what was going on in the story of Joseph. So sometimes geography will give you clues. In this case, I think we're looking at a time clue. That's what's going to help us. Because in Bo, where we realize we're in the last three plagues, locust, darkness, and the firstborn, it's going to tie the first week of this chronological Torah portion, Tzav, to the command in Bo, right? And so as Moses goes on, and he's telling the Hebrews what this Passover is all about, when they start asking questions about the lamb, it says, when your children say to you, what does this rite mean to you? You shall say, it is a Passover sacrifice to the Lord who passed over the houses of the sons of Israel in Egypt when he smote the Egyptians, but spared our homes. And the people bowed low and worshiped. Then the sons of Israel went and did so, just as the Lord had commanded Moses and Aaron, so they did. Right? So there's the Tzav, there's the form of Tzav that would connect you to this week's Torah portion, Tzav, command. And it's given to you in the context of Bo and the Passover sacrifice. And then it says, now it came about at midnight that the Lord struck all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sat on his throne, to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the cattle. And again, if you'll remember from when we did the year in workbook 2, very similar passage to this, where it talks about the wrath of the Lamb falling, and how from, the leaders of the land all the way to the slaves, there was no distinction among them. That it was the great equalizer. The wrath of the Lamb basically made everybody the same. Just like the Exodus did. The plagues, it made everybody the same, except at one point he says, okay, I'm going to make a distinction. This is how I'm going to show now the distinction. You're no longer going to endure these plagues like the Egyptians. You're going to be set apart. So in Exodus 12:26, it says, Pharaoh arose in the night, he and all his servants and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was no home where there was not someone dead. Then he called for Moses and Aaron at night and said, rise up, get out from among my people, both you and the sons of Israel, and go worship the Lord as you have said. Take both your flocks and your herds as you have said, and go and bless me also. So again, rise up language, rise up, that makes you think of the resurrection. And we know Yeshua died and was resurrected at the time of the Passover. And so we have a context here for the people as well, having a type of resurrection from Egypt, being told, get up and get out. Because remember, Egypt represents death and Abaddon. Remember, in this portion, the counselors are going to tell Paro, don't you know that Egypt is already Avda, lost? It's the same Hebrew word where we get Abaddon for Sheol, hell, the grave. And so we have this initial rising up at the Passover season. Now there's going to be another one as we get into the fall feast. And that's when you're going to see that the third days and the fifth days are both resurrection days. There's going to be more than one resurrection day. So we have a preliminary rising at Pesach. And again, maybe that was to signal to us Yeshua's resurrection. Say, this is going to be a Passover season. This is going to be a resurrection season at the Passover. But at least in the rabbinic literature, it's also a harbinger of another Passover rising, where the people rise up basically from the dead. They rise up from their captivity. even before we arrive at the fall feast of the Feast of Trumpets, or Rosh Hashanah. So there's a rising in the spring, there's a rising in the fall. And that's why I think we've got these two very important Shabbats that are embedded into both of these seasons. They're like bookends. Because just like your Shabbat HaGadol is going to be the Shabbat just prior to Pesach, so your Shabbat Shuvah is going to occur between Rosh Hashanah, the Feast of Trumpets, which we know is a resurrection day, and Yom HaKippurim, when whatever was decreed at the Feast of Trumpets will be sealed 10 days later. So there's a decree that goes out. The implication there is that during these 10 terrible days, or these 10 days of Ah, as they're called, in between there, if you will keep that Shabbat, you might realize that basically you got caught with your pants down. And so how do you repent? How do you make your way back? Well, we have a Shabbat of repentance that's going to fall in this season of repentance between the Feast of Trumpets and Yom HaKippurim. Does that mean that the latecomers, those who were not decreed for life at the Feast of Trumpets, maybe a few days later they figured out what was going on, they wanted to do repentance, they kept Shabbat Shuvah before the judgments were sealed at Yom Kippurim? Does that mean they're gathered in the cloud too? I don't know. That's not up to me. I just don't want to wait that long. I don't want to wait till Shabbat Shuvah, when the trumpets have already blown and the gathering has already started. That's not the time you want to ride the late bus. And I think the same applies to this Passover. If there's going to be a rising up of people, and remember, in every generation, he talked about passing this on to your sons in every generation, and your grandsons in every generation. Every generation, you have to behave as though this Shabbat HaGadol and this Passover are part of your rising, to the extent that many Jews will actually read through the Haggadah with their children on Shabbat HaGadol even before the Passover Seder, because of the context in which the commandment is given back here. Right? Because it's going to, your children are going to ask you when you go out and you look for the lamb. They're not going to wait until, dinner's on the table. They're more concerned with dinner on the table at the Passover Seder. They're going to be more concerned with asking you, what does this mean to you when you go select the lamb? Because remember, you have to guard the lamb, just like you have to guard the matzot. You have to guard the mitzvot. You cannot let the mitzvot become chametz. Don't wait till Shabbat Shuvah. They're going to say, why aren't we getting this lamb? What does this mean? He says, okay, you shall say it is a Passover sacrifice to the Lord. So basically, when they start asking, you start answering. And that's going to happen on the 10th day of Nisan, which is when they say, again, that this first Shabbat HaGadol would have fallen, which is what makes it important. That on this day, when you went out to select the lamb, the children would have started asking, why are we doing this? Why are we looking for a lamb? And so it's going to be, he said, your opportunity in future generations. And so this Shabbat HaGadol, if it's possible, gather your children, gather your grandchildren, and don't wait till the Passover Seder. Go through, at the level they can understand, go through the Haggadah with them and begin to explain the Passover story. Begin to explain to them what would happen on this particular day. Begin to explain to them what happened on the first Shabbat HaGadol, so that they would identify with the children going out with their fathers into the field to select a lamb, so that they can start to process this before they get into the hubbub of the Passover Seder itself, which tends to be, sometimes balagan. It's a lot. It can be a lot of confusion depending on how many people are there and how well they know what they're doing. And there's going to be a lot of people this year who are going to have to be responsible for their own Passover. They're not going to be able to rely on a community Passover. They're actually going to have to be parents and teach their children what this rite means to them. It's an opportunity. So don't wait till Passover night to go through the Haggadah. Start going through it. You can go through it now. But on Shabbat, that is a great time traditionally to start going through the Haggadah with your children and going through this story so that you can begin to internalize its importance. And this prophecy of rising from Egypt, this prophecy of rising from Abaddon, rising out of death and resurrection. Let's see, what time is it? I heard my alarm go off. 10:07. Okay, is this a good place to stop? All right, I'll show you one more thing, and then we'll pick up tomorrow with the Tuesday class and try to finish it up. Again, historically, nobody knows where the idea of Shabbat HaGadol came from. It's not in the Talmud. It's not even specified in the Tanakh, except we believe there are clues in the Tanakh. But it's not until the medieval period that anything's even written down on paper concerning it. And all we get is from Maxor Vitri. It says the people are accustomed to call the Shabbat prior to Pesach Shabbat HaGadol, though they don't know why. They're just doing it. So that did surface in medieval literature, but it seems to have come from a much older oral history. And if you're accustomed or acquainted with other cultures like Native American culture, their oral histories will even go back to the origins of mankind, or from the origin of that particular tribe relative to the other tribes. And much of that stuff, it wasn't even written down till the 30s, the 40s, and 50s. That didn't mean that that was the date of the story. The story went much farther back. So we don't date things from their first written appearance. Otherwise, you would have to believe that Gilgamesh is the actual flood story and what's in the Bible is false. Just a riff on it or something. So don't go by the first written appearance. But there is a clue that it may have been floating around back in the 1st century. Because as I'll go through the passage with the class tomorrow, there seem to be references to it in the letter to the Hebrews. And nobody even knows who wrote the letter to the Hebrews. Again, some people say Paul, but then others say, no, that language is way different from Paul's. What we aren't interested in, though, is the specific audience. It's written to the Hebrews. Kind of odd. Why not the Jews? That's going to be a term much more in use in the 1st century, not Hebrews. But if you'll go back into this real estate of Bo and Shemot, up until the time they come out of Egypt, the time that they spend in Egypt, they are frequently referred to as Hebrews. Joseph was referred to as a Hebrew. So at least the time spent in Egypt, there is a specific identity as being a Hebrew. Now, once they come out of Egypt, then you'll more commonly hear them referred to as Israel in the Torah and the Tanakh, or you might say house of Jacob or whatever. But it's specific to this time period that you get the predominant mentions of them as Hebrews. And so the writer to the Hebrews perhaps is sending those who would know a message to go back to these passages, possibly to an oral tradition that they would have had at the time concerning the Shabbat HaGadol and the days of wrath. And here's where the hints come from. This is from the prophet Malachi, and specifically Malachi chapter 4, verses 1 through 6. He says, "For behold, the day is coming, burning like a furnace, and all the arrogant and every evildoer will be chaff. And the day that is coming will set them ablaze, says the Lord of hosts, so that it will leave them neither root nor branch." Okay, that reference, put that back in the context of what you know about the supernatural bugs that come out of Abaddon in the book of Revelation, and how you've traced them back to the Tzila, that remember its job was to shoot its venom to destroy two things. It would destroy the root below and the fruit above, right? And that was the process, that was the little helper they had moving into the promised land. The bugs, translated locust, sometimes hornet, even John has trouble describing what they are. But their job specifically is to leave neither root nor branch. He says, "But for you who fear my name, the Son of Righteousness will rise with healing in its wings, and you will go forth and skip about." And that word there is push, to skip about, like calves from the stall. "You will tread down the wicked, for they will be ashes under the soles of your feet on the day which I am preparing, says the Lord of hosts." All right, before I finish that, again, put that back in the context of what you know about the souls under the altar and how those ashes represented the souls of those who brought the sacrifices, of how their lives became living sacrifices, and therefore those ashes represent their souls in the book of Revelation. And he's saying basically the sacrifices that the righteous have made, there's going to be a turnabout. They will no longer be the ashes, and instead it's going to be the wicked who are going to be ashes under your feet. He says, "On the day which I am preparing, says the Lord of hosts." And then he says specifically, "Remember the law of Moses, my servant, even the statutes and ordinances which I commanded him in Horeb for all Israel. Behold, I am going to send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and terrible day of the Lord. He will restore the hearts of the fathers to their children, and the hearts of the children to their fathers, so that I will not come and smite the land with a curse." All right, so obviously Egypt was a land smitten with a curse, with the death of the firstborn, the plague of the firstborn. This passage is part of every Passover if you're doing a traditional Haggadah. Because remember, Passover is not just the season of our freedom. It was also a great and terrible day of the Lord in its first context. It was also, a time of plagues, culminating in the death of the firstborn. But in it, he says, through this, he says, "I will restore the hearts of the fathers to their children and the hearts of children to their fathers." Where's the context for that? Because Moses specifically mentioned it. He says, your children are going to ask you, "What do you mean by this? What is this all about?" And he says, in every generation, you have to pass this message along to your children and to your grandchildren. Because a day is going to come when I am going to restore the hearts of the fathers to their children so that they will teach them these lessons of salvation and redemption. And I'm going to turn the hearts of the children to their father so that they will even ask the questions. You know, and see, that's not natural. We're living in a time of entropy when it comes to spiritual things. Most parents are not teaching their children the scriptures, much less the great and the terrible day of the Lord that's prophesied in the Passover. Most children discount their parents and think they're too old and they don't know anything because they don't know how to update their iPhones. They're disrespectful of their parents' experiences because their experiences were not unique to the skills that you need today in the world of technology. And that's going to be in every generation to an extent. There's a disconnect. But what is the one thing that connects you, that will connect you with your children and grandchildren and connect their hearts back to yours? It's this understanding of the great and the terrible, the day of the Lord, the Passover. And it's going to be connected to remembering the Torah of Moses, my servant. I'll go over that tomorrow. But along with this is Elijah the prophet, right? And that's why I say we're playing games with Elijah the prophet at Passover, making it fun for the kids, but the kids have no clue why they're looking for Elijah and what that means if he's there. Because as long as he's not there, it's fun and games. It's plastic locusts, it's ping pong balls for hail. You know, it's a dead fish and a pitcher of red Kool-Aid. It's fun and games. But if Elijah's actually there, the great and the terrible day of the Lord has begun. The cup of wrath is going to be poured out. And I think, you know, really that's why Yeshua is saying, woe to those who are nursing children in those days. Why? Because spiritual parenting means warning your children about this day. You know, at an age they can understand. Don't terrify a 2-year-old. This monster called Elijah the prophet is going to be outside the door at Passover. It has to be age appropriate. But as it is age appropriate, there's no reason to hold back on a grown-up. Right? If people want to come to Passover with you, great. But don't put the brakes on when it gets to Elijah the prophet and what that actually means to the world. Because we don't want them going from your Passover Seder thinking, oh, well, that was a wonderful cultural event. It wasn't a wonderful cultural event. It was prophecy that you just did. And for all we know, this is the Passover. For all we know, Shabbat HaGadol that's coming up could be that herald of the great and the terrible day of the Lord. We don't know. And that's the whole idea. He says, in every generation, I want you to act like it is. In every generation, I want you to experience the fear and the trembling that the Israelites felt. Can you imagine if there was anybody interested in how that night went, it would have been the firstborn. And see, if the father loved his child, he would perform the ceremony properly. If the child wanted to live, he would make sure the father did the ceremony properly. The hearts of the fathers and the children would be knit together on this Passover, but it wouldn't occur at sundown on Pesach. It would have started back on the 10th of the Nisan when the father goes out to select the lamb. That's when the hearts of the fathers and the children need to be knit together. And it's symbolized by this Shabbat HaGadol. And, you know, where he says back here, you will go forth and skip about like calves from the stall. That is an equivalent expression to Pesach. Because push, in Hebrew, it means to spring about, to frisk, to spread out. But ironically, it means to grow up. It means to grow up. Passover is a time to grow up. It's not the time to be a nursing child. It's a time for children to knit themselves to their parents, and for the hearts of parents to knit themselves to their children because of the great and the terrible day of the Lord that is coming. And that's what Pesach means. It means to skip. It's an equivalent expression. And so while there is this idea of the death angel skipping from one home to the next to harvest the firstborn, or to skip over because the hearts of the fathers and the children are knit together inside, for those who survived the Pesach of Pesach, the death angel skipping over, then there's this beautiful prophecy that they will be able to spring about. They will also skip about. Why? Because they grew up. Because they endured. They endured the torment. They endured. They overcome. They were crushed for the sake of the testimony. They suffered because they loved the Father. And he says, in that day, it's all going to change. Up until that point, it just looks like things go from bad to worse, to more worse, to worst, and worse than we ever thought they could be, worse. And it just kept getting worse and worse and worse. But at the end, he says, I'm going to flip things upside down for you. I'm going to use these events, and in the end, you're going to be the ones who skip about like calves from a stall. You're going to be turned loose from Egypt. There's going to be a resurrection. There's going to be a rising at that time. There will be an initial arising of the Hebrews, and then there will be a resurrection of the greater body of Messiah at the Feast of Trumpets. And maybe tomorrow we can look at how those two events, those two risings, fit together. But I know it's getting late for some of you, so we'll stop it here, and then we'll just pick up tomorrow.